Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am here today with the Rickard Sisters, Sophie and Scarlett. Together, they have produced two wonderful graphic novels chronicling 19th and early 20th century radical movements. They produced adaptations of the novels The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists and No Surrender. And we are going to talk to them today about both. So, Sophie and Scarlett, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Hello. Thank you very much for having us.
Well, I'm so delighted because I got The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists as a gift, and I couldn't believe it when I saw it, because I had seen the novel. I had never gotten through the novel because it's pretty big, but it's a classic of socialist literature. And then to have this delightful, funny, beautiful graphic novel adaptation that is like nothing else I've ever seen in the world was just such a wonderful present to receive. I guess, though, where I want to start is by asking you about both books together, because they pair very well. They have a similar aesthetic. They are based on, the one is about, the novel is about kind of socialism and takes place among painters in the early 1900s. And then No Surrender is about the suffragette movement. What is it about these kind of this early 20th century radical novels that appeals to you both so much?
So the two books, as you say, are siblings. The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist is the older brother. And like you say, it's a very famous book, and it's generally discussed as a book about men at work. We do find that when people talk about the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, they tend to only refer to about the first third. And because if we're all being honest, it's really hard to read. And that was one of the motivations for adapting it into a graphic novel. So in our version, it's sequential art, like reading a comic, and the only text is dialogue. So in fact, the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist is about the whole community, because it's about the families of those men who happen to know each other because they work together. And then No Surrender is the little sister. And it is a book about the women who fought for the right to vote at about the same time. But what the two books have got in common is that they were written by people with boots on the ground. So The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist was written by a painter and decorator about what his everyday life was like. And No Surrender was written by an active suffragette who was at a lot of the events that she describes in the book. And so what we like to do is amplify voices of a person who is trying to express their marginalization or their oppression. It just happens to be over 100 years ago.
But also surprisingly relevant to now. Both books have real strong sort of seeds in them, which are current affairs now, even though they're over 100 years old.
With No Surrender in particular, we were starting work on it, thinking about climate protests and Just Stop Oil, etc., and Black Lives Matter hugely that summer. And then 2 years later, it came out in November last year in America, right in the middle of the midterms, where women's rights to bodily autonomy was such a huge topic, which was like appalling to us that we'd managed to make something so relevant. We absolutely did not think that this would be a question again, yet here we are.
Yeah, I think the relevance of the two novels that you've chosen is certainly clear. This period that these are both set in is quite fascinating. I mean, I assume, Scarlett, just from an artist's perspective, right, doing something on the early 1900s gives you this wonderful opportunity to do the British class system with all of these, ladies in big hats and country gardens and, the workers in rags and the men in top hats. I mean, there has to be a certain appeal just to all of the wonderful ladies and gentlemen you get to depict in this.
British class system still looks like that.
It still looks like that. Yeah. Like, I think it's quite a good sort of shorthand, I suppose, particularly maybe for British readers more than American readers, that, by what people are wearing, you can tell their sort of social background and stuff. But really, like with anything, it's to do with the haves and the have-nots, isn't it? It's the rich and the poor.
But also the era, like the aesthetic of the era, is something that we're both particularly drawn to. I mean, Scarlett's art style, including all of the lettering and the commercial art, like the chapter headings are taken from, inspired by commercial art of the era. And it is a great way of expressing the kinds of things that you like drawing, isn't it, Scarlett? Just because, I mean, I know that there's a running joke between comic writers and comic artists that you're not supposed to, or artists complain if you put a lot of horses and bicycles and crowds in the script. And it's not my fault. That's just how
there are so many horses and bicycles and crowds.
In fact, there are clouds of horses and bicycles. But I didn't that was in the original novels. All I did is translate it. But it seems to me that I spend a lot of time trying to find something Scarlett can't draw, and I haven't got there yet.
Cows. Not confident drawing cows.
Really?
Yeah. I don't feel like I've ever drawn a good cow. I really need to put some effort in.
I hadn't noticed whether there are any cows across either of these.
Oh no, I shouldn't have mentioned it. You'll go looking.
I'm going to go looking for cows and scrutinizing their shapes. Well, I'm a big fan of like the floral prints of William Morris and such, and you get to do all of this, this beautiful ornamentation, and you get to.
Interestingly, I found that it was ridiculous because nobody wants to go into drawing a 380-page book that's full of William Morris wallpaper. But in the process of doing it, I discovered that the richer the house, the more decoration you put into the drawing, it somehow makes it feel more rich. So because I tried to get away with, not drawing the pattern on a dinner service where there's a whole chapter in No Surrender that's a dinner party. And I thought, I could probably just get away with just having white plates. But no, it just didn't look rich enough. So you just have to throw loads of stuff in
it. But also, it's an important theme of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. It's actually part of the story that the protagonist, Owen, is trying to explain to people that there is value to be had in quality workmanship and artistry and expertise and being given enough time to make a good job of something in detail instead of things being half done for less money.
Right.
And so it's important, like it sort of looks in on itself, Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, because it is about the sign-writing and it's about the sign-writer.
Or side painter, as you say in America.
The workmen in this novel are constantly being pressured to, for the sake of maximizing their employer's profits, go fast to a slapdesk job, do things that won't last. The level of intricacy to some of the drawings here. I mean, you both spent, I think it said 4 years on this first book. I mean, it really comes across.
We spent about 18 months each. So it was about 18 months to do the adaptation, the written adaptation, and then 18 months to draw it.
But we've got better at it since then. We didn't take so long with No Surrender, partly because we learned a lot and were more efficient, but also because we gave our publisher a really unrealistic deadline and worked ourselves to death.
Yeah, I just blow through my deadlines and they have to...
I can't bring myself to do that. I have to meet a deadline.
I mean, I wrote an article a year or so ago about some forgotten 19th century socialists in Britain that I found, because when you start excavating the history, especially in Britain, of the socialism of William Morris and such, there's such a fascinating and rich history of radicalism that it's so easy to forget. And then when you go back and you read these texts from the time, as you say, the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists can be hard to get through, but it feels so alive, and it's critical of the church, and it's got all of these ways of understanding the economy where you're looking at it and you're going, well, still true. So I think there's such value going to these. I mean, you have pointed out that this novel is famous in Britain, much less so in the United States. I think No Surrender probably a little more obscure, but for both of them, just showing how these people a century ago wrestled with so many of the same things and what they did.
And they're great stories that really do deserve a new audience. And we're also very conscious of Gen Z. See, I'm speaking American now. Of Gen Z are actively looking for socialist texts. They are looking around them and questioning the way the world's put together and asking, why does it have to be this way? And trying to find something to read that helps them understand it. And I mean, not to be too rude to Robert Tressell, because he's kind of buying our lunch here, but like, it's not an easy read. It's not something I would casually recommend to an 18-year-old. I mean, obviously, they vary massively, but, you know, it's just easier to get through, but you have access then to the story. You have access to the ideas without having to do quite so much work.
Yeah, it's difficult to get through for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, it was written in about 1909, so the language is quite hard going. There's sentences that go on for days. But the other thing about it is that, of course, he didn't have a editor when he wrote it. He wrote it, you know, when he got home from work, you know, on the building site, and it was published after his death. So, you know, he had mitigating circumstances. So, yeah, we want to bring it to a new audience. But the thing about the original is that over the years, you know, so many people have been given a copy of that book when they were sort of 17, 18 years old and said, it changed my life.
Yeah.
It changed the way I look at the world. It changed the way I understand politics and economics. And we wanted to be able to do the same thing, but with this version.
Yeah, perhaps you should say a bit more about who this guy, Robert Tressell, was, where this remarkable book came from.
So, Robert Tressell isn't even his real name. His real name is Robert Noonan, but he's also known as Robert Croker. And that's because his father was not married to his mother. His father had a whole nother family. Robert was part of like a side family for this quite well-to-do, respectable Dublin man. Happened to be a police officer, but by the by. And Robert had ethical and moral objections to his father and his money, so used his mother's surname and left Ireland for England. And then fairly sharply, we think there might have been some shenanigans, and I think he might have got into a bit of bother, went to South Africa, where he was painting and decorating, and that's where he was introduced to organised labour. However, it's not a great story, really, because he was organising for white labour on building sites in South Africa. So not cool, Robert. Anyway, then at some point in Cape Town, he contracted TB and split up with his wife. I don't think the two things were related. And he came home to Britain, to the south coast of England, with his daughter, and worked in a town called Hastings, which is where the Battle of Hastings happened, and worked as a painter and decorator, and in an extremely bad mood wrote this book after work every night. He then couldn't get anyone to publish it. Nobody was interested. And he and the daughter, who was now an adult, sort of 18, 19, decided that they needed a fresh start, a new start in Canada. And they worked their way up England to Liverpool, which is where the boat leaves for Canada. And they were trying to earn enough money for the passage when he died of TB. So he's buried in Liverpool. Kathleen, managed to sell the manuscript to a publisher, and she used the money to buy her passage to Canada, went off to Canada, never looked back, had a nice life. And the version that was published was really, really like bowdlerized. It had all of the difficult politics taken out, and it was very sentimental. And it actually ended with Frank Owen killing himself and his family, which is
such a weird choice.
Yeah. And it wasn't until I think it was 1945 that an enthusiast uncovered the original manuscript and had it published properly. And it became much, much more well known and is credited with influencing the election which brought Britain a government which brought us the NHS.
Yeah.
The National Health Service,
right.
And nationalised railways, nationalised coal.
So he may have posthumously gotten Winston Churchill thrown out of office, which is something that he never...
Basically, he was very instrumental, certainly.
Yeah. Well, it's incredible. I mean, such a tragic life himself, and never knew that the novel was going to get published, let alone that it would have any influence or that it would someday be this delightful graphic novel.
What's sad about it as well is that a lot of the novel is about trying to get people to listen to the fact that they're being, exploited by capitalism. And he's trying to tell his co-workers that this is happening to them, and they just can't, they just refuse to see it and sort of say, oh, I don't bother my head with politics, and things like that. And so when he died without the book being published, it must have still felt like that he wrote all those words. It's like 200,000 words or something about what he was trying to tell people, and still nobody was listening. So he would be very proud to know that people listened in the end.
Yeah, something that sort of recurs over and over in the book is that you mentioned Franco and the sort of main character who is a socialist who tries to convince his fellow painters and decorators that they are being exploited. There's a sort of kind of scene that is in like every other chapter where they're all sitting around and Frank Owen goes, I'll tell you what the real causes of poverty are. And then he sort of explains, and then they go, well, I read here in the newspaper. And so maybe you should tell us a little bit more about what actually happens in this book.
Essentially, the story is about this community of painters and decorators and their family. And what happens in the book is, as you said, Frank Owen is trying to get them to look at their circumstances from another point of view. So the title, which is impossible to say and very difficult to write on things, it refers to the fact that the workers themselves are the charitable benefactors of the bosses. So they work hard every day to make the boss rich. And that is all Frank Owen wants them to understand. And they just do not want to hear it. And they say things that you can hear all around you all the time, like, I don't bother with politics, like, there's always been rich and poor in the world, and there always will be. There's nothing you can do. We just have to put up with it. And he just wants them to stop putting up with it and do something. And throughout the book, Frank Owen explains like a systemic economic issue, and then you see it happening for real to the people in their lives. And there are lots of demonstrations of the impact of the daily grind of poverty on lots of different people. So there's an older couple that end up in the workhouse because he's too old to work. There's a younger couple where the wife of the couple is subject to a very particularly gendered form of economic risk, which is she is sexually assaulted by their lodger, who is paying to be in their house because they can't afford to keep their house without having a lodger. So there's lots of those kind of things. And also the children, we see how the children fare in this system where everybody's kept poor enough to make sure they go back to work tomorrow. I mean, I don't want to do spoilers, but at the end, there is some rays of hope that there might be some change coming, but it doesn't promise too much because, of course, as you've astutely observed, it's still happening now. We haven't quite had the socialist revolution that he was hoping this book would lead to. But as you say, I think in the mid-century, it really did look like it might. We got close.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that everything's sort of being undone again now. So a lot of the stuff that was nationalised is now privatised again and stuff.
Yes, indeed. There is something about reading this novel where you go, wow, it's so true. And then you go, ugh, it's so true. But Scarlett, I wanted to ask you about the fact that, again, I didn't realise that you had done this when I had started looking at the actual novel of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. And it is not something that strikes me as naturally lending itself to a graphic novel adaptation, because so much of the novel consists of people having arguments about economics, which, differs quite substantially from what we might think of as the usual plot of a graphic novel. So I just have to ask you, as an artist, how do you go about trying to make that exciting visually?
Well, a lot of it is down to the adaptation as well, because Sophie cut out things that were going to get too boring, I think. One of the things that I thought when I read the original is how much of the book is description. so much of the book describes in real detail what things look like and how they do stuff. The workmen are actively working on the house. He's describing in real detail what they're actually doing. And I was sort of thinking, if you could draw all of this stuff, then you could, tell half the story that way. And so it's quite atmospheric. It really is, in some ways, it's really much like of its time. It's really sort of 1910.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's really now. And that just was really interesting.
There are also some features of the story that particularly lend themselves to visual telling. So for the really famous bit of the original book is when he does the money trick and he demonstrates to all his friends using the bits in their lunchbox, basically how the capitalist system works. And that was ideal for making into a visual, because Frank Owen is an artist. He explains things visually. And so, yes, it lended itself in that way.
But also there were little tricks that I did, which is something I quite enjoy doing. So rather than having two people just talking, so you see one face and then another face, I normally will make them do something at the same time. So they might be painting, wainscoting, or I don't know, or skirting board? Can't remember what that's called in America. Baseboard, painting baseboards or something like that, while they're talking, so that there's movement going on at the same time as the dialogue. And that just keeps things interesting. And mixing up the angles.
Yeah, you do funny things with camera angles. So sometimes we're looking up at people and sometimes we're looking down on their heads. And I love it because when we're in the process of making a book like this, Scarlett will do a page of art and then send it to me, like a picture of the page, to my phone as a message. And it's always exactly what I asked for and also a surprise, because it's always not quite what I'm expecting, but most often in a good way.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable the amount of variety you managed to introduce across these over 300 pages into, these scenes that kind of do recur, as I say. And the other thing is much of this novel takes place in this one house that's being built, different kinds of rooms of this house. And I have to say, you draw the house exactly as I pictured the house. It's the house.
That's good.
We had someone tell us last week that the landlord, the man behind the bar in the Cricketers pub, was exactly how he'd been imagining him all these years. So we seem to be getting away with all sorts.
Well, I want to talk to you about No Surrender as well. So let's move to that. Tell us about Constance Maud and this novel.
So Constance Maud was the daughter of a Hampshire vicar. Am I right? I think so.
Yeah.
And she was an active suffragette. The word suffragette means specifically somebody who was fighting for votes for women by being civilly disobedient. So she was actively breaking the law as a means of protest because they were
not just those who believed in votes for women, but those who specifically broke the law in order to try and achieve it.
A suffragist campaigns for votes for women. A suffragette breaks the law and is willing to go to prison for the cause. Although Constance Maud was never actually arrested, it wasn't for want of trying, and she does refer to it in the story, is that the police had a knack of arresting the working class women and leaving the posh ones alone because they might get into trouble, which is, I think, something we can probably see in today's. So the story is very exciting. It's the story of a Lancashire mill worker who is very poor, and she makes friends with the niece of the man who owns the mill she's working in. And together they go off to London to defeat the patriarchy and get up to all sorts of things. The book was written as a recruitment tool. So it was designed to encourage women of all types, of all classes, every type of woman you could think of. It was a very inclusive story, which was one of the joys of making it into a graphic novel, to make sure that it really was properly inclusive. But it was making the point that this benefits every woman, not just a certain kind of women. But it was written and published before some of the real violence of the suffragette movement. So it was before bombs and arson and stuff. So in some ways, it's a bit of a gentle introduction. They throw stones and they do the kind of things that Just Stop Oil have been doing, but nothing too scary. But we've tried to interspersed, like occasionally in the book there's a double page of just newspaper articles and bits of ephemera from the time, and they are all real bits of, I mean, Scarlett's drawn them all letter by letter because that's what she's like, but they are actual news items from the time. And you can see the bias in the press in the way that things are reported from both sides. And it's a made up story, but it is about events that were very real.
Yeah. And it incorporates quite a lot of things that actually happened, but she's just changed the names of the people that did them. So some of the real events happen to the characters in the book. An upper class woman who tries to get arrested and they won't arrest her. So she dresses up as a working class woman and then they arrest her, you know. So it's like making a point with stuff like that. Yeah.
I love how even though it's about, the suffragettes, the class element it just runs so strongly through the whole book, this book as well.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, with a book about suffragettes, there is an inevitable forced feeding scene, which is...
I have to say, Scarlett, your illustration for the force feeding scene is... I'm used to most of your style is quite cute or charming in a certain way. This is not cute. This is very, 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 very disturbing.
Really distressing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And had such a good way of dealing with it. So when we were talking about how we wanted this scene to be, so strictly speaking, legally speaking, a force feeding is a kind of rape because it's forced penetration. I wanted it to feel like that when I wrote it. And a lot of the first-hand accounts talk of it as a really sort of surreal and disturbing experience because of the pain and the fear really putting you outside your own body and things. So we'd listen to first-hand accounts of women who'd been through it. And what we realized is that it needed to be kind of like trippy and psychedelic. But when I think trippy and psychedelic, I'm thinking like the 1970s and LSD. But Scarlett pointed out that in 1910 or 12 or whenever it was, that wasn't an option. So she used what would have been this surreal and psychedelia of the time, which was Impressionism.
Impressionism, yeah.
It's quite a stunning, the spread on, where it, because it kind of builds up and then culminates in the, represents the internal experience of the person going through it. And precisely because it's such a contrast to the rest of the book, it really does shake you. So I think you pulled that off.
Be a little bit careful because people occasionally ask us what age group our books are suitable for. And in the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, we just took the swearing out and said, all ages, it's suitable for anyone. But of course, it's not going to appeal to a young child because of the political argument. Having said that, we have a super
You
fan.
don't know. We have an 11-year-old subscriber to our Current Affairs magazine, so you never know. There are some kids out there.
We have a super fan of Ragged Trousered Philanthropists who was 9 when she first got it.
There you go.
You never know. But with No Surrender, we've had to be like, when people have asked me, I've had to say, no, like it's suitable for all ages, but you've got to expect that there is a scary scene of force feeding in it, and let it be at parents' discretion.
I have to tell you, Scarlett, I don't know if this is your feeling, but I feel like you, with some of the scenes in this, really seem to have tried to take things to the next level in this book. I mean, some of the panoramic scenes, the scene on the stage and the crowd scenes, and there are more things that kind of shock you in this book because of the contrast, the visual contrast. Because it is, this book, like the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, a lot of it consists of arguments, people having political discussions.
Yeah, I mean, as Sophie said, it was kind of designed, the original was designed to be a recruitment tool, and that was the same with the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. That's why they kind of go together. They're written in a very similar way because they've got the arguments for and against, and people trying to show the impact of theoretical beliefs through people's lives, and so they go together very well from that point of view. But yeah, crowds. Oh my God, there were so many crowds in No Surrender.
The final chapter of No Surrender is essentially one enormous crowd scene because it was literally the biggest demonstration London had ever known. And Scarlett drew every single one of them.
And also a lot of the banners that are in there based on real banners. So the banners that they're carrying in the protests and the demonstrations, most of them were based on real banners that were done at the time and were in that particular demonstration.
There are scenes in here that make Where's Wally look minimalist. I have to say.
I should have put Wally. Why didn't I put Wally in
it? I mean, he might be in there somewhere for all I know, because everyone in the world seems to be in here. One of the cool things about this, cool is the right word, but one of the fascinating things about this novel is the strong presence of women who are against women's suffrage and the arguments that they make.
Isn't it extraordinary? Yeah. When we first started doing it, we were thinking about, what we'd learnt at school about the suffragettes and things. And we did a little bit about, the Pankhursts, who you might be aware of in America, and the Emily Wilding Davison, who was killed by the King's horse at the Derby. But we didn't learn about what the actual arguments against it were, and the idea that it was women arguing, obviously men as well, but a lot of women sort of saying, we shouldn't be having the vote. Politics is a man's thing. It's not for women. Yeah. And, this whole idea that if you have the vote, then men will stop opening doors for you and being polite and stuff.
People actually explicitly saying a woman's place is the home and she is in charge in the house, and it's the man's job to make the world nice so that she can concentrate on creating and bringing up children. Thanks, mate.
Yeah. And the whole idea that if you don't have the vote...
I think one of the interesting things about it is seeing the moral and ethical questions surrounding civil disobedience using a subject where the vast majority of people are like, yeah, okay, they were right.
Yeah, this is not especially controversial today.
Yeah, not exactly. So not so controversial. Yeah, they were deciding to break the law, breaking property, getting up to all sorts of things to try and make the point that they were right. And to put that next to environmental protesting or protests about racial equality or about how cities are policed, for example, and to have those same arguments of saying, well, I agree with their cause, but this kind of thing just does them no favours and puts everybody off. That's in No Surrender. So it was really fun to have things that are so relevant today. And we didn't put stuff in, like the things that are in there that seem so relevant were written by Constance Maud over 100 years ago, because a lot of the time it just doesn't feel that long ago because they were having the same conversations.
It's really interesting. We had a situation in Britain, which probably didn't quite get to the States, where there was a painting by Van Gogh in an art gallery.
Oh, was this the soup?
The soup.
Yeah, the soup throwing. Yeah. I think we wrote about this in Current Affairs.
And what was really fascinating about the souping of the sunflowers is the reaction to it. We had just been doing research for No Surrender and reading loads and loads of newspaper reports from the time of the suffragettes. And it was basically the same thing. They were saying identical things. These are just a sort of, what's the word? Spoilt young people.
People doing it for attention.
Yeah, just rich kids doing it for attention. And, it's just vandalism and... In
the era of No Surrender, there was a woman called Mary Richardson who took a machete to a Velasquez in the National Gallery.
Oh, really?
What's the painting called, Scarlett?
Rokeby Venus.
Rokeby Venus. And she went into the National Gallery with her machete, somehow, and hacked it to bits. It had loads of big holes in it. And she said that it was because that painting as an object had more value in the world than real live women.
It's a painting of a naked woman.
Oh, yeah, that was some context, is a painting of a naked woman. And that is exactly the same message that the sunflower supers were making, is that this flower here is worth millions, but have you seen those ones out of the window? And yes, throwing soup on it might have been a bit disruptive. I mean, actually, it would only needed a wipe with a damp cloth, so it was no big deal.
It was fine. Unlike the slashed one, it was...
Yeah, exactly.
But what difference will it make when the National Gallery's underwater? The Thames rises. So it's just all so familiar. I have to say that Mary Richardson is also not cool because she ended up running the fascists. So, she was a great suffragette. And
so she wanted votes for women so she could vote for fascism.
I think it was the journey she was on.
Yeah, this is one of the things about suffragism, which is very interesting, is that, in fact, it says it all the way through the book. People are saying we can't give women the right to vote because they'll all vote against the interests of men. And there were women saying, but that's just not how people work, because there are women from all different backgrounds who have all different political beliefs. We're not all like lumped together. And that's a really sort of telling thing, because there were quite a lot of people who were very active in the suffrage movement who went on to be active in some pretty horrible things. And there were some really good ones.
Yeah. I didn't foresee the rise of Margaret Thatcher or the fact that women are just as capable of voting against the interests of women.
Exactly.
One of the points that No Surrender makes is that the interests of women are actually the interests of human beings, which is, it was what it comes down to in the end. I mean, I think one of the characters says when a woman is disenfranchised, it affects her children and her male children just as much as her female ones. So the interests of humanity are better served by not ignoring 51% of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you've said, these books from the 1910s are just strikingly relevant, but they are not widely read, at least in the case of Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, not widely read all the way through these days. And so you've done humanity a service by producing these absolutely gorgeous and funny adaptations that bring out the rich stories here and the characters, and they're just delightful. They're just delightful books. So congratulations to you both. Can't wait to see what you work on next. And thank you to the Rickard Sisters for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.